Hello, I'm John McNamara, the retired Adult Faith Formation Coordinator from St. Anthony's Parish in Rocky Point. I'd like to talk about the three popes and the McCarrick Report. The McCarrick Report details knowledge of the Vatican about Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and discusses the knowledge of the sexual misconduct that was brought to the attention of several dicasteries within the Vatican organizations which kind of oversee the operations of the church and the actions that were taken to address that situation. When the report was released on November 10th in 2020, headlines proclaimed big failure by three popes to address the charges against McCarrick. Many said, here we go again, the church is covering up, and what's worse, even popes were covering up. What was actually revealed with regard to those three popes, Pope St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. We're going to take a look at each of the popes and say exactly what was their involvement in this McCarrick situation. Two of the previous popes, before Pope St. John Paul II, Pope St. Paul VI, and Pope John Paul I, had not received really any of the allegations of any sexual misconduct with regard to McCarrick. Pope St. John Paul II approved the transfer of Bishop McCarrick from the Diocese of Newark to the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. That was rather a significant position. The head of that archdiocese was actually usually made a cardinal and was important in working with the leaders of the three branches of government. So that position would have been given a lot of scrutiny by the Pope before he made that appointment. Now, discussions about the appointment of Cardinal McCarrick to move from Newark to Washington, D.C. were not without controversy. Cardinal John O'Connor, who was head of the Archdiocese of New York, wrote a letter on October 28th of 1999 to Archbishop Gabriel Montalvo, and he was the Vatican nuncio in the United States, would have been kind of in charge of the operations of the church in the United States from the point of view of the Vatican. He would be overseeing it. So he would be very important in this process of appointing who would actually be the head of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and also other appointments within the church. In this letter now that Cardinal O'Connor wrote, he recommended that McCarrick not be considered for a cardinal see like Washington, D.C., because he was afraid of the possibility of scandal from certain things that he had heard. Not that he had clear proof of anything, but he had heard various rumors and suspicions and possibilities, and he was like, let's not make this appointment. This could possibly lead to something. We don't have any definitive proof yet, but probably not a good thing to make this appointment. Now, Cardinal O'Connor was himself very well respected in the Vatican and very well known to Pope St. John Paul II. And so it would have taken a lot, really, to override his recommendation. His recommendation would have carried a lot of weight. Nuncio Montalvo decided that he would contact four bishops who had worked rather closely with McCarrick. And they would have been Bishops McHugh, Breen, Hughes, and Smith, and all would have had some association with McCarrick. Breen less than the others, but they would have known a lot about McCarrick, and so a good move on his part to contact them and get some feedback from them. He wanted to get some input in terms of, did they know of any allegations at all about McCarrick? Now, these bishops either downplayed the allegations or omitted them entirely. Two of the bishops, in particular, Bishop McHugh and Bishop Smith, had directly observed inappropriate conduct by Bishop McCarrick in a catering hall in Newark, New Jersey on January 25th of 1990. According to the testimony of Monsignor Dominic Bettino, he was the vocation director of the Camden Diocese. He was present that night, and he also observed the conduct. Now, Monsignor Bettino did not report it, until 2018 to the Vatican. So it took him some time to report it, really 28 years, a long time to report it to the Vatican, but he did report it. And he said that these bishops were there and they witnessed it, and they did not report it either, unfortunately. Now, some commentators will really be quick to jump on Pope St. John Paul II for elevating McCarrick to Washington, D.C. in 2000 and for making him a cardinal on February 21st of 2001. His faulty judgment with regard to the Legionnaires of Christ and Father Marcial Maciel demonstrated his lack of understanding, really, of the abuse issue and his tendency to believe the perpetrators of abuse over the victims. However, this situation with McCarrick is a little bit different than that situation, and certainly Pope St. John Paul II can be rightly faulted in that situation because he didn't really pursue the testimony of the victims in that situation. Here, though, a little bit of a different situation. There was no certainty at this time that McCarrick had engaged in any sexual misconduct. It was established very clearly that McCarrick had shared his bed with the seminarians, but there were really no complaints of any sexual misconduct from any of the seminarians. There was an allegation from a priest, referred to in the report as priest number 1, of sexual misconduct, but this was really viewed as lacking any credibility because priest 1 admitted to abusing two teenage boys. So they said, should we believe this priest because he really has this pattern of abuse? So they kind of said this probably doesn't have that much credibility, and so they didn't pursue it. Now, Father Benedict Ramsey, Dominican priest, spoke about these sleepovers with the seminarians in a letter that he wrote to Nuncio Montalvo, which was also presented to Pope St. John Paul II, and he said that there was a situation where he had the beach house, and frequently a seminarian would share the bed with him. There were usually 5 seminarians, only 4 beds, and so one had to sleep with McCarrick quite frequently. Again, this spoke about inappropriate behavior, but there was no certainty that there was any sexual misconduct and that there was no one who came forward with a complaint against McCarrick. None of these seminarians said he did anything inappropriate, and so they said, this was kind of not a good thing, obviously, but probably didn't rise to the level of sexual misconduct at this point. Now, Bishop McCarrick also wrote a letter to Pope John Paul II in which he stated in the strongest terms that he had never had any sexual relations with anyone, and the Pope had a long, very personal, very warm relationship with McCarrick, and McCarrick had a very engaging, outgoing, and warm personality. McCarrick was a proven fundraiser, and he was very generous with his funds, not only to some of the bishops in the United States and some of his friends, but to those in the Vatican. And so that probably was a factor as well. And he was known for securing donations for the Pope as well. And he was also well known to have a lot of very strong relationships with a lot of the leaders in Washington, D.C. in the political parties. So that was a factor. He was well known, well liked, a good fundraiser, a very wonderful person to be with and chat with and talk with. So the Pope had this kind of relationship with him and said, well, it looks like he's a pretty good guy overall. And this thing about the seminarians, it doesn't seem to really rise to the level of anything where there was sexual misconduct involved, at least in the Pope's judgment. And Bishop McCarrick had denied anything, so that was a factor as well. Another factor that the report mentions is the cultural one. Pope St. John Paul II had experienced situations in his native Poland under communism, where the communist officials would make allegations against certain clerics, particularly popular clerics, well-known clerics, and this would limit their effectiveness and even rise to the level of imprisoning them. It was a natural leap for the Pope to put the allegations against McCarrick in the light of his own experience within Poland. The obvious difference in retrospect when you look at the situation is, well, that was coming from communist officials, and some of this information was coming from priests and others, so really a difference there. All of these factors, particularly a lack of any specific complaint of sexual misconduct against McCarrick, his warm relationship with the Pope, his fundraising abilities, his strong denial, the Pope's own cultural background, led Pope St. John Paul II to override the recommendation of Cardinal O'Connor. This was a clear mistake, but it really does not rise to the level of a cover-up at this point because there was no specific allegation. Now, what about the next Pope, Pope Benedict XVI? Well, Pope Benedict XVI inherited a situation where Cardinal McCarrick was already now head of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. Now, in 2005, he received new details about Priest One's allegation. After he had originally extended McCarrick in his position for an additional 2 years, after his mandatory retirement age of 75, he quickly, when he received these new allegations, asked for McCarrick's resignation. However, he did not launch an investigation at this time. Archbishop Vigano, who worked in the Secretariat of State at this time, wrote 2 memoranda, one in 2006, one in 2008, and he asked for a canonical process to be opened to look into this situation. He said, there's something here that doesn't seem right. Let's open a process, a formal process. Since McCarrick was a cardinal, only the Pope could do this. It was reserved to the Pope. But rather than open a canonical process, Pope Benedict XVI decided to appeal to McCarrick's conscience and his ecclesial spirit, and called upon him to have a lower profile and to restrict his travel. Cardinal Ray, who was the prefect of the Congregation of the Bishops in the Vatican and would oversee all of the bishops and the cardinals as well, did not launch an investigation, but he did instruct the nuncio in Washington, who is now not Montalvo, but Nuncio Sambi. He said, convey these instructions to McCarrick, tell him to keep a low profile, to restrict his travel, not to be involved in a lot of different situations. So these instructions were transmitted to McCarrick in 2008. Now, was this a cover-up? Why didn't Pope Benedict offer and to open this formal canonical process that Archbishop Vigano had requested? Well, first of all, there was no credible allegations of child abuse at this point. McCarrick swore on his oath as a bishop that the allegations were false. The allegations of misconduct with adults were from the 1980s. There was no indication of a recent misconduct. So they figured these were old, and he's now over 75. He's going to have a low profile. He's not going to be active as the really Archbishop of Washington. He has no formal role in the church. So let's just keep it at that level. Now, in April of 2008, Richard Sipe published an open letter to Pope Benedict in which he mentioned the allegations about McCarrick at the beach house, and also 4 priests who reported unwanted sexual advances. At this time, McCarrick was retired. His activities were being monitored by Nuncio Sambi, and then in 2011 by Nuncio Vigano. That's Archbishop Vigano had gotten the position now of the nuncio in the United States, and he was the one who had written the 2 earlier memoranda, so they were monitoring it, they were aware of it, he was supposed to keep a low profile. They thought that would be sufficient. It would be hard to make the case for a cover-up, as, again, there was no credible accusation against McCarrick at this time. It was apparent that he was certainly guilty of poor judgment, inviting the seminarians to share a bed with him. Was the information which was presented enough to open an investigation? In retrospect, we would say, well, probably should have. But being that McCarrick was now retired, he was limited in his activities, Pope Benedict and his advisors determined that no canonical process was warranted at this time. Certainly a mistake, but really not a cover-up. Now, what about Pope Francis, our current Pope? Pope Francis knew McCarrick prior to becoming Pope, but he did not have a close personal relationship with him as Pope St. John Paul II did. Archbishop Lugano claimed that he had two conversations during which the McCarrick situation was discussed with Pope Francis, and they did meet together in June and October of 2013. That would be contradicted from the letter that Lugano sent to Cardinal Olouet, who is now the Cardinal of the Congregation of the Bishops and took over that position, on June 13th, 2013, in which he related that the claims of priest 3, the new claims, had been rejected in court. So the new claims had come up, they had been investigated, and the court said, these don't seem credible, and the court actually threw those out. That letter would clearly indicate that there were no credible allegations of abuse against McCarrick at that time. Lugano did not follow up his meeting with Pope Francis by any written report, which stood in contrast to his memoranda of December 2006 and May 2008. One would have thought that if he had these meetings with the Pope, he would have followed up with a memoranda, which was his usual procedure. Lugano also did not provide a copy of Cardinal Ray's letter of 2008 to Pope Francis concerning the restrictions that had been placed on McCarrick. Now, Archbishop Becchio, who was from the Vatican Secretariat of State, had a conversation with Pope Francis in 2013 about McCarrick, during which he mentioned these allegations about some immoral conduct with seminarians in terms of the beach house. He also mentioned that Nuncio Montalvo was disappointed in the selection of McCarrick as Archbishop of Washington, D.C., didn't think he should have gotten that position. Again, he was aware, Archbishop Montalvo, of Cardinal O'Connor's letter, so he thought, that he shouldn't have been made the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. But Archbishop Becchio had not pursued any investigation of these claims. It was just things that he had heard, rumors, so he couldn't substantiate the claims that he had heard. Now, Pope Francis was under the impression that these were old claims from years ago, that they had been dealt with by Pope St. John Paul II, by Pope Benedict XVI, so he himself did not pursue an investigation. As we look back, we can say, hey, definitely a mistake, but certainly not a cover-up, because there was no concrete allegations of abuse that was presented to cover up. Now, 4 years later, in June of 2017, the Archdiocese of New York learned of the first known allegation of sexual abuse by McCarrick of a victim under 18 years of age, which had occurred in the early 1970s. So this went back, 47 years. It was a long time. After the accusation was investigated and it was deemed credible, Pope Francis requested McCarrick's resignation from the College of Cardinals. He had a credible allegation. It was substantiated. He should be removed. McCarrick was subsequently, after that, removed from the clerical state following an administrative penal process by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which kind of oversees these processes. So if there are these allegations, they're investigated, they're brought to the congregation, they determine, is there substance to it? If it is, the priest, the cardinal, the bishop is removed from the clerical state. And the congregation found that he was culpable of acts that were in contravention of the sixth commandment of the Decalogue involving both minors and adults. Now, as we look back on the situation with regard to Cardinal McCarrick and with regard to the three popes that we've been discussing, Pope St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and the present Pope, Pope Francis, what can we say in conclusion? Well, the McCarrick situation took place when they were leading the church, so the three popes all bear responsibility for the lack of response to his outrageous behavior. There were several reports from Priest 1, Bishop Hughes, McHugh, Smith, Cardinal O'Connor, a psychologist, Dr. Richard Fitzgibbons, Father Benedict Ramsey, the Jesuit priest, the Dominican priest, and Richard Sipe. And they clearly indicated that McCarrick had invited seminarians on a regular basis to share a bed with him. One would think that this fact alone would have been enough to launch a comprehensive investigation into McCarrick's interactions with the seminarians at the beach house. It would seem obvious that you would want to determine if there was any sexual misconduct, any pressure applied to these seminarians in any way, anything stated in terms of an implied threat or reprisal. The seminarians did not go along with their bishop's request. Obviously, you're putting these men in an awkward, terrible situation. Well, did anything occur? And again, there was no allegations from the seminarians, so it was kind of dismissed. I mean, then nobody had brought anything up. But it would have been certainly prudent and important to determine that by interviewing them, investigating the situation. This was not done. The initial failure to respond was from Pope St. John Paul II, so he would bear the most responsibility because he, made him a cardinal. So certainly he had gotten information about this situation. He should have investigated more thoroughly, and he did investigate it somewhat, but not thoroughly. Pope Benedict involved in it, but he was placing these restrictions on McCarrick. But again, he did not launch an investigation to determine was this credible. Pope Francis did not launch an investigation when he became aware of the allegations about this matter, and he just concluded it was an old matter, it had been dealt with, and there were no formal specific allegations. Now, can you say that this constitutes a cover-up? Well, not in the sense that there was a specific allegation of sexual misconduct that was ignored. However, the lack of an investigation into exactly what took place with the seminarians and responding to that certainly qualifies as a refusal to deal with a potentially abusive situation. The lesson that is learned from this is that any allegation of improper conduct must always be thoroughly and completely investigated.